Close your eyes for a moment. Picture your grandfather, let's call him Frank. It's 1962. Frank pulls on his work boots, grabs his lunch pail and heads to the factory floor. High school diploma? Check. Union card? Check. A pulse? Barely after last night's bowling league. Frank works 40 hours a week. He comes home exhausted, cracks open a beer, watches Bonanza and somehow, he's saving up to buy a 3-bedroom house. Not in 20 years. Not after selling a kidney. In 2, maybe 3 years. The math was simple. The median home cost about $12,000. Frank's salary? Around $5,600 a year. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. Work hard for a couple years, save your pennies and boom, you're a homeowner. The American dream wasn't aspirational marketing. It was basic math. Fast forward to 2026. You have a master's degree. Your LinkedIn says you're passionate about synergy. You've got 17 skills endorsed by people you've never met. Your coffee addiction has its own line item in your budget. And despite all this, you're seriously Googling, how much does a kidney sell for, because that might be your best shot at a down payment. Here's where we are. The median home price hit $412,500 in 2024, roughly 5 times the median household income. To afford that home, you need an annual income of around $126,700. The national median household income? About $75,000. Do that math. You need to earn 170% more than the average American just to qualify for the average home. That white picket fence isn't a symbol of freedom anymore. It's a financial albatross. A generational punishment. A fever dream from a bygone era when hard work actually correlated with housing stability. And this isn't vibes. This is balance sheets, mortgage calculators, and cold, hard economic reality. Over the past 5 years, home prices surged 54%, nearly double the 29% gain in wages. The United States is hemorrhaging from a housing affordability crisis with a price tag north of $1.7 trillion, representing inflated asset values, excess household debt, and the cumulative cost of treating homes like stocks instead of places where humans actually live. So grab whatever cheap drink you can afford. Rent's due in 3 days, as we autopsy exactly who or what murdered the American housing dream. The great inventory drought, or what I call the golden handcuffs trap. Let's rewind to Frank's era for a second. When Frank bought his house in 1962, the market was flooded with options. Post-war America was a construction fever dream. Developers were throwing up ranch homes and bungalows like confetti at a parade. Land was cheap. Zoning was permissive. Construction was fast. Supply and demand shook hands, smiled politely, and everyone went home to watch I Love Lucy. Cut to 2026. The housing market isn't a handshake anymore. It's a cage match. A blood sport where the prize is a 900-square-foot fixer-upper that smells like regret and cat urine. First problem, we physically ran out of houses. You might be thinking, but I see construction cranes everywhere. Sure. But what you're seeing is a drop in an ocean-sized bucket. After the 2008 financial crisis, U.S. homebuilders didn't just slow down, they fundamentally changed behavior. The subprime collapse wiped out developers, crushed lenders, and left the survivors pathologically risk-averse. For over a decade, they underbuilt relative to population growth. The result? A cumulative housing deficit. Estimates from Freddie Mac, the National Association of Realtors, and independent economists put the shortfall somewhere between 3.5 million and 7 million homes. That's not a rounding error. That's entire metropolitan areas that don't exist. But wait, it gets worse. Problem 2. Nobody wants to sell the homes that do exist. Meet Bob. Bob bought his house in 2021. He locked in a 30-year fixed mortgage at 2.8%. His monthly payment? About $1,600. Affordable. Predictable. The financial equivalent of a warm hug. Now Bob wants to move. Maybe he got a new job. Maybe his neighbor plays the tuba at 3 a.m. Whatever. Bob looks at today's rates, hovering around 6.5% to 7%, and does the math. If Bob sells and buys another house for the exact same price, his monthly payment doesn't just increase a little. It explodes, from $1,600 to nearly $3,200. Is Bob moving? Absolutely not. Bob's staying put. Bob's renovating the kitchen. Bob's learning to love the tuba. Bob will die in that house. This is the lock-in effect. Economists call it that. I call it the golden handcuffs. More than half of all outstanding U.S. mortgages carry interest rates below 4%. A massive share sit below 3.5%. That means tens of millions of homeowners are financially trapped, not because they can't pay, but because moving would permanently downgrade their standard of living. The market is frozen solid. And this created a paradox that confused everyone in 2023 and 2024. Normally, when interest rates spike, home prices fall. Borrowing gets expensive, demand drops, prices correct. Economics 101, right? But that didn't happen. Prices stayed near record highs. Why? Because while demand weakened, supply completely evaporated. Here's the twisted logic. If 10 buyers are fighting over one house and 5 drop out because rates are too high, you don't get a crash. You still have 5 buyers fighting over that same house. The price doesn't fall. It sticks. Or climbs. Let me hit you with the most depressing stat of all. In the 1950s and 1960s, the median home cost roughly 2 to 3 times median household income. Today, it's 5 times the median household income. In high-demand metros, LA, San Jose, New York, that ratio blows past 8 to 10 times. The ladder to the middle class hasn't been pulled up. It's been set on fire. And while regular families fight for scraps in a frozen market, there's another player at the table. One that doesn't care about mortgage rates at all. Wall Street's landlord era, or as I call it, you will own nothing and be happy. You've heard the conspiracy theories. BlackRock is buying every house in America. Then the fact-checkers arrive, adjust their glasses and say, actually, institutional investors own less than 3% of all single-family homes. Both statements are technically true. But that 3% statistic? It's a masterclass in statistical misdirection. It's like saying piranhas only occupy 1% of the Amazon River. Cool. But if that 1% happens to be the exact stretch where you're swimming, that statistic becomes meaningless. Here's reality. Institutional investors aren't buying homes evenly across the country. They're hyper-targeted. They focus on entry-level single-family homes in fast-growing Sun Belt metros: Atlanta, Phoenix, Tampa, Charlotte, Dallas. And in those markets, investors bought 1/3 of all single-family residential properties sold in the second quarter of 2025. That's the highest percentage in 5 years. Let me paint you a picture. You, a human being with a job and dreams, show up to an open house. You like it. You make an offer at asking price. You write a heartfelt letter about raising your kids there. Then a representative for a multi-billion-dollar investment firm calls the listing agent. They offer $30,000 over asking. All cash. No inspection. Closing in 7 days. You lose. Not because you're irresponsible. Not because you didn't budget. But because you were competing against institutional capital that doesn't borrow at consumer rates and doesn't care about monthly payments. And this isn't accidental. The strategy is explicit. A widely cited MetLife investment management report projected that by 2030, institutional investors could control up to 40% of the single-family rental market. Not ownership of all homes, but dominance of the rental supply in key metros. That distinction matters. Because renters don't build equity. The endgame isn't flipping houses. The endgame is a permanent renter society where ownership is optional for corporations and impossible for families. Take Invitation Homes, the largest single-family rental owner in the U.S., with tens of thousands of properties. On investor earnings calls, they don't talk about shelter or community. They talk about rent growth, yield optimization, ancillary revenue streams. Translation: higher rents. Fees for services you didn't ask for. Algorithmic pricing that adjusts faster than your paycheck. Now here's the part people miss. This isn't just about Wall Street being greedy. It's about timing. These firms entered after 2008, when prices were crushed, builders were bankrupt, and regular buyers were terrified. They scaled up quietly while regulators napped. By the time the public noticed, the portfolios were already built. Yes, lawmakers noticed eventually. A bill called the End Hedge Fund Control of American Homes Act was introduced. It made headlines. It sounded tough. But as of 2026? It's stuck in legislative limbo, diluted by lobbying pressure from real estate, private equity, and finance industries with a very strong interest in keeping housing classified as an asset class, not a human necessity. So while you're skipping avocado toast and canceling vacations, remember, you're not just competing with other families. You're competing with algorithms, balance sheets, and capital pools that can wait decades for returns. To Wall Street, your neighborhood isn't a community. It's a yield curve. The silver tsunami that never crashed. For nearly a decade, hopeful millennials and Gen Z buyers heard the same comforting bedtime story: just wait for the silver tsunami. The theory was simple. Baby boomers, the largest, wealthiest generation in history, control roughly 42 million owner-occupied homes. As they age into their 70s and 80s, they'd inevitably sell those big suburban fortresses, downsize, or move to assisted living. That flood of inventory would crash prices and give younger generations a fighting chance. Well, it's 2026. We're standing on the beach. The horizon is clear. And the water is dead calm. The tsunami didn't just miss us. It never formed. Instead of selling, boomers are doing something models underestimated. They're aging in place. 61% of baby boomer homeowners say they never plan to sell their homes. That's up 7 percentage points from 2024. And get this, only 10% plan to sell within the next 5 years. Once you run the numbers, it makes brutal sense. Meet Susan. She's 75. She lives in a paid-off suburban home she bought decades ago. 54% of boomers own their homes outright. No mortgage, no monthly payment. Just property taxes and insurance. Why would Susan move? Reason 1, there's nowhere better to go. If Susan sells for $600,000, she still needs to live somewhere. A modest 2-bedroom condo in the same area costs $500,000 to $550,000. After fees, moving costs, and HOA dues, Susan ends up with less space, more restrictions, and roughly the same net position. Reason 2, just 1 in 10 seniors can afford assisted living facilities. Assisted living averages $5,000 to $9,000 per month, $60,000 to over $100,000 per year. For most boomers, staying in a paid-off home, using Uber and Instacart makes far more financial sense. Reason 3, the tax incentive. If Susan sells while alive, she pays capital gains on decades of appreciation. If she dies owning the home, the tax basis steps up to current market value for her heirs. Holding until death can save her kids hundreds of thousands in taxes. From a purely financial perspective, not selling is the rational move. The result? The average homeowner tenure jumped from about 6 years in 2008 to over 13 years today, the longest on record. Homes aren't circulating. They've become retirement vaults. So instead of a generational handoff, we've entered a stalemate. A 32-year-old couple, pregnant with their first child, is competing in a market where millions of homes are frozen by demographics, tax policy, and rational self-interest. The silver tsunami didn't crash. It calcified. The extinction of the starter home, or what I call the profit problem. Okay, so you can't buy an existing home because boomers are staying put and Wall Street's buying everything else. The obvious solution? Build more homes. Specifically, build the modest 1,000 to 1,400 square foot starter homes that define the post-war middle class. Except there's a problem. That product barely exists anymore. In the 1970s, roughly 40% of newly built homes were entry-level. By 2024, under 7%. You're not imagining it. Homes are getting larger, more expensive, and more complex, even as households get smaller and incomes fail to keep up. But here's the key. This isn't because developers suddenly became cartoon villains who only want to build McMansions. It's because the economics of building a cheap house are fundamentally broken. Let's walk through the math. Play general contractor. You want to build a modest starter home in 2025. First, land. Thanks to restrictive zoning, minimum lot sizes, and NIMBY resistance, buildable land near jobs is scarce. Even in secondary metros, a lot runs $80,000 to $150,000. Second, regulation and permits. In high-cost states, California, Oregon, Washington, New York, regulatory costs alone can account for 20% to 30% of the final home price before construction begins. These costs are largely fixed. They don't shrink when the house gets smaller. Third, labor and materials. The construction industry faces a historic labor shortage. Skilled trades are aging out. Younger workers were funneled into college instead of apprenticeships. Wages for electricians, plumbers, and framers have surged. Materials remain structurally more expensive than pre-pandemic. Added up conservatively. Land, $100,000 permits/regulation. $70,000, $90,000 labor/materials. $140,000 to $160,000. Your break-even cost is already $310,000 to $350,000. Before financing, risk, marketing, or overhead. Now the developer faces a choice, the brutal incentive problem. Build a small starter home, sell it for $350,000, clear maybe $20,000 profit. Or build a larger, higher-end home on the same lot. Land and permit costs barely change. You spend more on finishes and square footage, but you can sell for $650,000 to $750,000. Your profit jumps to six figures. This isn't speculation. Builders openly acknowledge this in earnings calls. Developers aren't charities. They respond to incentives. And the incentive structure makes cheap homes economically irrational. So instead of a healthy ladder of options, we get what economists call a barbell market. Luxury on one end, aging rentals on the other, and almost nothing in the middle. But wait, it gets worse. Many developers found a workaround. Don't sell the homes at all. Rent them. Entire subdivisions are now built explicitly as single-family rental communities, owned by institutional landlords from day one. By 2025, a record share of new housing starts in Sun Belt markets were designated build-to-rent. These homes look like starter homes. But they're never meant to be owned. Here's the loop. You can't buy an existing home, inventory's frozen. You can't buy a new starter home, they don't pencil out. So you rent. Because you rent, you can't build equity. Because you can't build equity, you never escape renting. It's a closed system. And if you're thinking, fine, I'll just move somewhere cheaper. Well, that brings us to the next problem. The Zoomtown hangover, or how we exported the crisis. For a brief, shining moment in 2020 and 2021, it looked like the housing crisis had been hacked. The logic felt airtight. If you can work from anywhere, you don't have to live in San Francisco. Move to Idaho. Move to Montana. Keep the tech salary. Buy a house. When? It sounded like freedom. In reality, it was an economic invasive species event. We called them Zoomtowns. Boise, Idaho. Austin, Texas. Bozeman, Montana. Spokane. Bend, Oregon. Asheville. Before the pandemic, these places had something rare in modern America. Housing markets loosely aligned with local wages. A teacher or firefighter could plausibly buy a home and live a middle-class life. Then the laptop class arrived. Picture Boise in 2019. Median household income, $55,000. Median home price, $250,000. Uncomfortable but survivable. Then a remote worker shows up from Palo Alto. He makes $250,000 a year. He sold a modest California home for $1.5 million. He arrives with cash, stock gains, and zero emotional attachment to local price norms. To him, a $400,000 four-bedroom feels like a fire sale. So he bids $100,000 over asking. All cash. No contingencies. This didn't happen once. It happened thousands of times. By mid-2022, Boise home prices were up nearly 60% in 2 years. Austin rose 40% to 45%. This wasn't organic growth. It was external wage arbitrage, high salaries parachuting into low-cost ecosystems. Local buyers didn't lose because they made bad choices. They lost because they were priced out by people earning 4 to 5 times local wages. Fast forward to 2026, the hangover. Two forces slammed Zoomtown simultaneously. 1. Return to office mandates. Remote work wasn't as permanent as advertised. By 2023 to 2025, Amazon, Google, Meta, even Zoom itself began enforcing partial or full RTO. That engineer in Montana is told, be in Seattle 3 days a week or resign. So they try to sell. But prices have come down from the 2022 peak, yet never returned to pre-pandemic levels. The homes are now too expensive for locals and not desirable enough for transplants under new work rules. Liquidity vanishes. Welcome to the housing uncanny valley. 2. The local economy breaks. When housing costs double in 3 years but wages rise 10% to 15%, the service backbone collapses. Teachers leave. Nurses commute an hour away. Police departments face staffing shortages. Restaurants close early. Cities like Boise, Austin, and Bozeman have reported critical labor shortages in public services directly tied to housing costs. A town cannot function if the people who run it cannot live in it. The bigger point? We didn't solve the housing crisis by moving. We exported it. We took the dysfunction of coastal markets, extreme inequality, speculative bidding, investor pressure, and copy-pasted it nationwide. The geographic arbitrage is gone. There's no longer a place where you can say, I'll just move somewhere cheaper. Because everywhere cheaper became expensive. And then stayed that way. The insurance apocalypse, the silent killer. If mortgage rates don't get you, insurance premiums will. This is the variable almost no one calculates when scrolling Zillow at midnight. People fixate on principal and interest and think, okay, I can stretch for that. What they miss, by 2026, The cost of simply insuring a home has quietly become the second mortgage no one talks about. Let's start with Florida, the canary that already died. Florida's property insurance market is effectively broken. For years, it was stressed by litigation abuse and a legal environment that made Florida responsible for a wildly disproportionate share of U.S. insurance lawsuits. Then came the accelerant: more frequent, more expensive hurricanes. Major insurers, farmers, State Farm, pulled back sharply or exited entirely. That left homeowners with one option: Citizens Property Insurance, the state-run insurer of last resort. And when the insurer of last resort becomes the largest insurer in the state, something has gone very wrong. By 2025, the average Florida homeowner's insurance premium exceeded $6,000 per year, roughly 4 times the national average. In flood or wind-exposed areas, quotes of $8,000 to $12,000 became common. That's an extra $700 to $1,000 per month layered on top of a mortgage. Not for granite countertops. Just to exist. But it's not just Florida. California presents the opposite but equally dangerous version. After catastrophic wildfire losses, State Farm and Allstate froze or severely restricted new policies across large portions of the state. In the Midwest, premiums surged due to hail, derechos, and tornado clusters. In the Northeast, older housing stock combined with rising replacement costs drove steady premium inflation. Different hazards. Same outcome. Insurance is being repriced for a riskier world, all at once. Here's the nightmare scenario playing out nationwide. You finally buy a home. You close. You move in. Then months later, a letter arrives. Notice of non-renewal. Your insurer is dropping you. You scramble to shop for coverage. But your roof is 15 years old. Your zip code is now high risk. No one will insure you. And here's the catch. Lenders require insurance. If you can't get it, the bank steps in with force-placed insurance. This isn't a helpful backup. It's financial punishment. Force-placed insurance protects the bank's asset, offers minimal coverage, and often costs 2x to 10x more than a normal policy. Your escrow payment explodes overnight. And this is why we're seeing something new in 2025 to 2026. People aren't losing homes because they lost their jobs. They're losing homes because insurance made the payment mathematically impossible. This creates what I call functionally obsolete homes. Homes that are structurally fine in livable neighborhoods, but financially toxic for normal buyers. They can't be insured affordably. They can't be financed safely. So who buys them? Cash buyers. Institutional investors. Wealthy individuals who can self-insure. Once again, the market quietly filters assets away from the middle class. Not through conspiracy but through math. Final thoughts. So here's the question. Is the American housing dream dead? If your definition is work hard, buy a cheap house at 25, retire comfortably at 65, then yes, that version is dead. It wasn't lost. It wasn't abandoned. It was systematically dismantled. It was strangled by a supply drought, buried by institutional capital, and the grave is currently guarded by 6.5% to 7% mortgage rates that lock millions out of ownership. This isn't a temporary glitch. It's a structural shift. The U.S. is drifting toward a model that already exists elsewhere: higher long-term renting, smaller living spaces, later household formation, more multi-generational living. In other words, a European-style housing system, but without Europe's stronger social safety nets. That doesn't mean life is over. But it does mean the rules changed quietly, permanently, and without asking for consent. Here's the silver lining most people miss. You're not crazy. You're not lazy. You're not bad with money. You're operating inside the most hostile housing affordability environment since the Great Depression, adjusted for income. Previous generations didn't win because they were smarter. They won because the game was easier. Recognizing that isn't self-pity. It's clarity. The American dream isn't gone. It's just no longer one size fits all. Survival, and eventually stability, may look different now. Buying with friends or siblings. House hacking duplexes or ADUs. Relentless job hopping to outpace inflation. Geographic flexibility when possible. Or yes, redefining fulfillment beyond a 3-bedroom ranch and a white picket fence. None of these are failures. They're adaptive strategies in a rigged environment. The worst thing you can do is internalize a systemic failure as a personal one. Final reality check. Home ownership is no longer the default reward for adulthood. That's painful. That's destabilizing. But pretending otherwise is worse. Understanding the system doesn't guarantee victory. But it does prevent you from blaming yourself for a game designed to exclude you. Thanks for watching. And seriously, good luck out there.